The dust came before the horses. It always did out here. A brown wall rolling across the Nebraska flats like something that had made up its mind about the morning and wasn't open to argument. Then the platform. New pailboards in the courthouse square, not yet weathered into the gray of everything else in Harlan County. A crowd that had gathered to profit from the day. And then silence. The kind that fell before a verdict. Because the man they were bringing up the steps had to duck to clear the beam. Because his shoulders changed the geometry of the space around him. Because every person in that square took one step back without knowing they'd moved. Nobody bid, nobody warned her, and in the last row a woman's hand went up. The dust came first. Always did out here. Rolling across the flats of Harlan County like something with a grudge and nowhere better to be. Nebraska, in the summer of 1876, didn't soften itself for anyone. Didn't apologize for the heat. Didn't explain the cracked earth or the bleached sky or the wind that moved the misery from one place to another and called it weather. Ruth McAllister knew that dust the way she knew the shape of her own hands. Not as something that visited, as something that stayed. She was up before the sun. Not because anyone counted on her for it, because the bed was wrong. Had been wrong for 2 years. James's side held a shape that wasn't his anymore. Just the memory of weight pressed into horsehair and cotton. And lying next to that particular absence required a kind of endurance she'd learned to save for daylight hours. So she rose, pulled her boots on in the dark without looking, went to the porch and stood in the gray pre-dawn and breathed the morning air until her chest decided to cooperate. 3 hens with diminishing enthusiasm. One aging horse named Buck who had developed philosophical objections to most requests. 80 acres of cracked Nebraska ground that the Harlan County Bank held a growing note on. And $16 in a tin box under the kitchen floorboard that she did not count because counting it was the same as admitting it was all there was. The paper had come on Tuesday, 3rd one. She'd known by the weight of it in her hand before she opened it, the specific heft of language that had shifted from polite to firm. She read it once, standing at the kitchen table in the early light, and did not read it again. Set it flat on the wood and pressed both palms against it like she could hold it down. Like if she held it down long enough it would change what it said. It did not change what it said. $27 in her apron pocket. That was the number she'd arrived at after an hour of arithmetic she didn't want to do. $27 and a south fence line down in 3 places and winter coming the way it came in Nebraska, without announcement or mercy or the slightest interest in your readiness. Agnes Dover had come 3 mornings back. Rode over on her good horse, because Agnes always had the good horse and the good well and the soil that the drought had roughed up rather than ruined. She settled into Ruth's one sturdy chair with the ease of a woman who considered herself a permanent fixture in whatever room she occupied. 52 years old and 4 years widowed, and she'd processed the whole experience with the brisk efficiency of someone who viewed grief as a scheduling problem. Strong backs to be had at the county auction. Agnes didn't say it unkind. Just matter of fact, in the particular way of people who weren't desperate. Men who know cattle. No fencing. You need fencing, Ruth. You need that south line looked at before the first freeze. Ruth had looked at her own hands, the calluses at the base of every finger. The crack in her right palm that never fully healed because she never stopped using it long enough to let it. James would have argued against the auction on principle. Would have had 3 reasons ready before Agnes finished her sentence. All of them principled, and none of them practical. James had believed tomorrow would be better than today, and he'd been mostly right about that. Right up until the morning the bull came down wrong and he didn't get up. He'd installed a mechanism on the well the summer before he died. Some valve arrangement to keep the water clean. And he'd died before explaining how it worked. And Ruth had spent 18 months hauling water from the creek a quarter mile away, because the solution was 20 feet straight down and she hadn't known to look for it. She missed him the way you missed a limb. The real pain and the phantom pain both occupying the same space at the same time. I'll think about it, she'd told Agnes. She thought about it for 3 days. She thought about the bank notice and the fence and the empty north barn where James had planned to expand and never gotten to. She thought until thinking stopped being the activity and going became the activity. So she went. The courthouse square in Harlan held more people than she'd seen outside of a funeral. Wagons filled every side street. The hitching posts along the main road all occupied, horses standing patient in the heat. Every man in the county with cash money and the confidence that came with it had gathered with the barely concealed energy of people who expected to profit from the morning. Ruth tied Buck at the far post under the old cottonwood where the shade was. She worked her way through the crowd slowly, knew most of these faces, nodded at a few, them. Avoided the Hendersons' eyes because they'd been to the bank the same week she had, and looking at each other felt too much like looking in a mirror that only showed you the bad parts. The platform had been built fresh. New pale boards not yet weathered into the gray of everything else in Harlan County. Bixford, the auctioneer, round-faced and damp, wearing a vest purchased in more optimistic times, was testing the podium with his fists. Two of Sheriff Clay Holt's deputies stood beside him with the practiced boredom of men assigned somewhere they hadn't chosen. Ruth found a spot at the back edge of the crowd, her $27 folded in her left hand. She hadn't planned to bid on anything, she was here to look, to be practical in the way Agnes had suggested and James would have debated and the bank notice had made non-negotiable. The first lot went fast, the morning found its rhythm after that. Rise and fall of Bixford's voice, the muttering calculations from the men with money, the particular shuffle of men being evaluated and purchased. A blacksmith, a carpenter she recognized whose work she'd seen and respected. A farmer from the eastern quarter who'd lost 3 seasons to weather and worse decisions. She watched all of it with her hands still and her $27 unspent. It was past 11 when the crowd changed. She felt it before she understood it. A collective drawing in, a silence that fell harder and faster than the ones before it. She turned toward the platform. 2 deputies were bringing Lot 17 up the steps. And the man between them made the platform boards register his arrival with a sound like a structural complaint. He had to duck to clear the wooden beam framing the courthouse awning. Not a polite dip of the chin. A real accommodation, the kind that came from long practice navigating a world built for smaller men. 6'6" at the minimum, and she knew it immediately the way you knew certain facts about terrain, not by measuring but by the body's own calculation. Shoulders wide enough that the deputies on either side of him looked like they were escorting a barn door. Arms hanging at his sides with the weight of something load-bearing. Wrists in iron cuffs, his hands the size of supper plates. Broad through the chest in a way that changed the geometry of the space around him. The kind of size you needed a moment to fully see, to take in all at once, because the eye kept finding new dimensions to account for. Not what made the crowd draw back, the burlap sack over his head. Rough cloth, off-white, stained brown-red in the upper portion, dried dark enough to have been there longer than this morning. Rope around his neck held it in place. His clothes beneath dark canvas work pants and a flannel shirt gone gray before it was torn at knee and elbow, ground in dirt that had settled over days. He stood completely still. Not the stillness of shock, not the stillness of a man beaten down into submission. The stillness of someone who had made a specific decision about how to occupy this moment, upright, patient, present to everything around him without appearing to be moved by any of it. Like the outcome of the next few minutes was information he would receive when it arrived, and nothing about hurrying toward it would improve what it turned out to be. The whispers started at the front of the crowd and moved backward like fire in dry grass. That's the one who killed Vance. Marshal Denton Vance, down in the Dakotas. Bare hands. They found him standing right over the body. Hasn't said a word since they brought him in. A woman 2 rows ahead of Ruth, not quietly, cursed. That's what I heard. Ruth knew the name, Denton Vance. Everyone in the territory knew it, the way you knew certain weather systems, not from direct experience, but because word found you regardless. 12 years with a federal badge. Effective, people said in official settings. In other settings, other words. Cases closing before they should. Money appearing in places it hadn't started. A particular way Vance had of conducting himself that made the people who might have asked questions decide not to. And the man on the platform had killed him with his bare hands in a location behind a saloon, and had stood over the body, without running or explaining or offering a single word in his own defense. Bixford approached the podium and Ruth watched his morning's confidence drain out of him like water through cracked ground. Lot 17. The voice that had carried easily through 2 hours of bidding came out smaller. Careful. Strong back. Experience with livestock and fencing. Will open at $5. Silence. Not the considering silence that preceded other bids, where she could feel the crowd running calculations. This silence had a shape and a direction. It said, not for any price. Bixford tried again, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief. Consider the labor value alone. $3. Say 3. The men who'd been leaning forward all morning calculating every lot had taken a collective half-step back, unconscious, unanimous. Ruth watched the man on the platform. He didn't shift during Bixford's appeals, didn't angle toward the sound of the voice or pull against the cuffs. or show any evidence that the auction was something happening to him rather than something happening nearby. He simply stood and waited. Not defeated, not resigned. He had the patience of a man who had outlasted worse mornings than this one and had the evidence to prove it. She had seen men in bad circumstances. Seen what difficulty looked like on them, in the set of their shoulders, in the way they stopped quite meeting anyone's eye. This man looked like he was somewhere else entirely. No, that wasn't right. He was here. She could feel it from 40 feet away. The attention behind the burlap, the absolute awareness. He knew exactly where he was and who surrounded him and what was being said about him. He simply wasn't afraid of it, and that was the thing she couldn't make fit with everything else she was looking at. $2. Bixford's voice had gone to nothing. Just a man making sounds at a crowd that had made its decision. $2 for lot 17. Surely someone, she didn't decide to raise it. That was the truth of it. The thing she would turn over later in the way you turned over decisions that had already been made before you made them. The hand went up like it had been waiting for her to stop paying attention to it, like it had been watching that platform long enough and had its own opinion about what came next. Her own voice surprised her in the stillness, clear and carrying. $2. The crowd turned them. Every face in the square swinging toward the back where Ruth McAllister stood in her work dress with her hand in the air, and $27 folded in her fist and 20 of them still there. Agnes Dover's voice came from 3 people to her left, not loud, just very precise. One word, her name, carrying approximately 17 different concerns that Agnes didn't have the space to enumerate. Someone in the middle said something about poor James McAllister's widow. She'd been a McAllister 8 years, but some people in Harlan still filed her under the name she'd been born with, in the category of people who'd had a hard run of it. Bixford looked at her like she had simultaneously saved his morning and created a problem he hadn't budgeted for. He scanned the crowd one final time. Nobody moved. $2. The authority all the way gone. Going once. Going twice. A pause that lasted exactly as long as hope. Sold. To the lady at the back. The crowd dispersed with the speed of people who had decided the spectacle was over, and the consequences were someone else's. Ruth worked her way forward against the departing current. Deputy Morrison, young and official and uncertain in the combination that seemed standard equipment for new law, handed her the paperwork. She signed where he pointed. She was watching 2 deputies remove the handcuffs from the man on the platform, watching how he held still for the removal with the same careful economy he'd brought to everything else. And she was trying to account for what she'd just done with $2 that had been her last $2. He moved carefully coming down from the platform steps. Not the careful of someone afraid of being hurt. The careful of someone already hurt and managing it without making it anyone else's topic. She noticed him favor his left side on the descent, the smallest adjustment in how he distributed his weight, and she filed it away. She walked over. Up close, the scale of him was different from what distance had shown her. She was not a small woman. James had always said she stood like she was daring the weather. And this man made her feel the objective mathematics of size in a way that had nothing threatening in it, just the simple fact of dimension. The top of her head came to somewhere below his shoulder. His hands, now uncuffed and hanging at his sides, were large enough that her grandmother's cast-iron skillet would have fit in one palm. Ruth McAllister, one of them had to start. I own a farm about 4 miles north of here. I need fencing work and someone to look at the well and various other things. You'll sleep in the barn. There's food. He turned his head toward her. The burlap moved with the motion. She couldn't see his face, couldn't read his expression. Just the angle of the head, which told her she had his full attention, and the deliberate quality of how he held himself, each movement considered rather than automatic. He nodded once, specific and unhurried. All right, she said, which was her word for things she hadn't organized yet. Wagons this way. Getting into the wagon bed, he solved himself. Worked out the geometry of folding that much body into the available space with methodical efficiency that had nothing apologetic in it. He settled with his legs extended because there was no other option, his hands resting on his knees, fingers laced with careful precision. Like a man who had decided exactly where his hands should be and had placed them there. Buck registered the weight and communicated his displeasure through the angle of his ears and a pointed look over one shoulder. Easy, Ruth told him, more habit than instruction. 4 miles of road. Neither of them spoke. Ruth kept her eyes on the track ahead and stole sideways glances at intervals she tried to make less obvious than they were. He sat without fidgeting. Without the small, restless adjustments most people made when they were confined and uncertain of their circumstances. His head was slightly angled, The way someone listened to a place they were entering for the first time. She thought he was cataloging the countryside and then revised that. He wasn't cataloging, he was receiving. The sound of grasshoppers working the field grass, the quality of the afternoon air over cracked ground, the distant pull of the creek running lower than it should. Whatever else is true about this man, she thought, he pays attention. The farm appeared over the low rise. She'd always called it a rise, though by honest measure it was barely an incline. She watched it the way she'd been watching it for 2 years, counting what remained. The house standing, the barn standing, the cottonwood in the south yard putting in another season despite everything, the chicken coop listing but not yet committed to falling, and the well stone in the center of the yard dry for 18 months, which she looked at now the way you looked at a failure you'd stopped expecting to fix. She pulled Buck up by the barn. He was already out of the wagon bed by the time she turned around. She hadn't heard him move. Given his size, this should have been physically impossible. But there he stood in the yard with his head making a slow, deliberate arc, and she had the clear impression of someone conducting an assessment, not admiring, not judging them, reading the place the way you read land before you worked it. Well, first, if you can, she pointed. South fence line is down in 3 places. Barn is where you'll sleep. East end stall, cleared out, pallet and blanket in there. A pause. Are you hurt? Left side. The head tilted. A silence, then a small, precise shake. Not quite denial, more like it doesn't factor into what happens next. All right, she said. She went inside and put water on for coffee and stood at the kitchen window while it heated and watched him cross the yard to the well. He stood over the stone rim with his arms at his sides and his head down. The posture of a man in a specific conversation with a problem. Then his hands went to the rim and he leaned over it and stayed there for a long while. Something about watching him. Something she recognized and couldn't name yet. She made the coffee. When the sun dropped toward the hills, she carried a cup out to the barn along with a tin plate of beans and cornbread. He was in the east stall, sitting against the wall with the pallet and blanket untouched beside him. The posture of someone waiting to find out whether stopping was permitted before making himself comfortable. She set the cup and plate on the stall edge. He looked at them, or she assumed he did. The burlap still covered everything. More in the morning, she said. She was at the barn door when she turned back. Some instinct she hadn't consulted with her rational mind, the kind that had been keeping her alive in small ways for 32 years. You don't have to keep that on, she said. Not here. She stopped. Didn't know how to finish the sentence without making it condescending. Not going to tell anyone. Not going to treat you like a problem. Not going to pretend there isn't a person under there. Just, she said. He didn't move. She went back inside. She stood at the kitchen window for another stretch of time she didn't account for. Watched him there in the barn doorway he'd eventually moved to, the burlap still in place, his face turned toward the low hills to the west where the last light was going out over the grass. She thought about a night she couldn't remember clearly anymore. A girl of 12 in a creek bank in Kansas and a young man who'd appeared from nowhere with his horse and his nerve, and who'd gathered up 11 scared people and walked them through the dark and disappeared before morning. 20 years was a long time to carry a face you'd never fully seen. She went to bed, lay in the dark, thought about the well, about solutions that might be right there, about the things you didn't know yet that would make them visible. She was most of the way to sleep when the sound came from the barn. Not a scream, not quite. Something from deeper in the chest than screaming. The sound a body made when the waking mind had been keeping everything organized and the sleeping mind gave up on the project. It went on for a short time and stopped. She lay still and listened, and the night was quiet again. She pulled her boots on, crossed the yard in the dark and sat down on the ground outside the barn door. Not inside, just outside, close enough that if he woke, he would know the sound had traveled and someone had heard it and hadn't gone away. She sat there with her back against the warm barn boards and listened to the night do what Nebraska nights did. An owl working the south field, the creek running its low sound from a quarter-mile away. Stars so thick up there it looked like someone had spilled them. The boards behind her had held the day's heat and released it slowly, the way old wood held things longer than you expected. After a while she heard movement inside, the careful reorientation of a large body waking in a space it was still learning. Then through the barn boards, low and rough with exhaustion, "I'm sorry. You don't apologize for that." She said it to the yard in front of her. To him through the boards behind her. "We all carry things into sleep. That's not an apology situation." A long pause. "Were there 11? Not a question exactly, more like a man confirming a number he'd been holding on to. She understood immediately. He was asking whether they'd all made it, whether that night had held. All 11, she said. All of them. She didn't hear another sound from inside the barn, but she stayed until the first gray line showed in the east and the dawn birds started their inventory of the morning. When she finally stood and went back to the house, she set 2 cups on the counter before she'd thought about it. Just did it. Both cups, both there. Then from the east, hoofbeats. Not a single horse on a morning errand. The deliberate rhythm of multiple horses moving with official purpose. She went to the window. 6 riders on the eastern road, a territorial flag she recognized. At the front, a man in a pressed suit and cleaned boots, the specific combination of someone who had taken time before coming and decided the impression mattered. Federal. She knew the type without knowing the name. And turning away at the far end of the road, already heading back toward town at a pace that said done and finished and nothing more to see, Agnes Dover's horse. Ruth looked at that departing horse, counted to 3. She opened the top drawer of the kitchen dresser and took out the small leather-bound notebook Wade had set on her table the previous evening. No explanation offered, just placed it there while she was washing up. She'd intended to look at it in the morning. She'd been awake until past midnight reading it instead. Dates and names and dollar amounts in careful small handwriting, 3 years of it. A catalog of what Marshal Denton Vance had been doing across 4 counties that had nothing to do with federal law enforcement and everything to do with what a badge made possible when nobody was checking. She closed her fingers around the notebook. From the barn she heard him already moving, already awake and already coming. The barn door opened and he stepped into the yard, still large, still steady. The burlap was gone. She saw his face for the first time in the early morning light, and she stood very still for a moment, just taking it in. Strong jaw, gray eyes with the particular quality of someone who had been paying attention for a very long time. A scar along the left side of his chin faded to silver. He was looking at her with the same direct, unhurried focus he brought to everything. And there was something in it that she had no word for yet. Wade, she raised her voice just enough to carry across the yard. Come inside, he came. She put the notebook in her aproned pocket and stood straight and looked at the 2 cups of coffee on the counter and thought about wells, about solutions that had been sitting there the whole time waiting for someone with the right question. She went to the front door and put her hand on the handle. The riders were already at the fence line. Marshal Fletcher Dunn entered Ruth McAllister's front room the way federal authority entered small spaces, not loudly, not with theater, but with the settled weight of a man who believed the room had been arranged for his arrival. He was 40 or so, dry-faced, suit pressed, boots cleaned. He'd taken time this morning, had decided the impression mattered. 6 riders stayed outside. Sheriff Clay Holt positioned himself near the door with the expression of a man caught between 2 forces and not yet sure which one he belonged to. Dunn moved to the center of the room without being invited and stood there taking it in, the worn furniture, the clean floor, the single good lamp, the kitchen beyond where 2 cups of coffee sat on the counter going cold. Wade stood in the doorway between the front room and the kitchen. No burlap, just his face. Just those gray eyes and the particular quality of a man who had made some decision this morning about what he was and wasn't going to keep wearing. And the reason for the decision wasn't something he was going to explain right now. Ruth had noticed when he came through the door. Hadn't said anything about it because it wasn't the moment. Dunn looked at him for a long time. Callum, the voice of a man confirming an inventory item. Wade said nothing. His hands were loose at his sides. His feet planted with the patient solidity of someone who had been in rooms like this before, and had learned that the first person to speak from a position of uncertainty generally ended up with less than they started with. You understand why I'm here, Dunn said. Still nothing, not defiance. Defiance had a charge to it, an active current. This was something quieter. The deliberate economy of a man who had made a specific decision about what he would and wouldn't volunteer, and who intended to hold to it, regardless of how much official weight was brought to bear. Dunn turned to Ruth. Ma'am, I need you to step outside while we... Simple. Placed on the floor between them like something that wasn't going to be moved. Dunn looked at her with the minor recalibration of a man whose next 60 seconds had just rearranged themselves. This is my house, Ruth said. That's my front room you're standing in without being asked. I bought this man at a county auction with the last money I had, and he's been working my farm since. And if you have things to say about him, you can say them where I can hear them. The county contract, Dunn said. Dropping into patience the way a man dropped into a lower gear, doesn't supersede federal jurisdiction when a fugitive is involved. He's not a fugitive. He was processed through a legal county debt proceeding. If you want to reclassify that, I'd like to see the documentation. Dunn looked at her for a moment, then at Wade, then back at Ruth. And she saw the small adjustment behind his eyes, the recognition that she hadn't said this to fill the air, and that he did not in fact have that specific piece of paper on his person. I have a federal warrant, he said. I know you do. Ruth reached into her apron pocket. I saw the one at the hardware on 3rd. She set the notebook on the side table between them, not gently, not as theater. Set it down the way you set down a tool. Here. This is what we're working with. I also have something you don't. Dunn looked at the notebook, looked at her, looked at Wade. He picked it up. The front room went quiet in the specific way of rooms where something was being decided. Outside, one of Dunn's horses shifted against its rein and the leather sound came through clearly, which meant everything else was very still. Holt at the door stopped shifting his weight. Dunn read. He read slowly, which Ruth found she respected even now. The deliberateness of a man building an understanding rather than confirming one he'd already arrived at. His expression didn't change much. But his left hand flattened on the notebook's cover partway through, pressing down, the physical translation of arithmetic going wrong. 3 pages in, he stopped. These are allegations. These are dated records with named parties and specific amounts, Ruth said. Written over 3 years by someone with direct knowledge of the transactions. What they become is a function of whether anyone investigates them. I have no way to verify. One of those names is George Alderman. She watched his face. There. A flicker, brief and immediately controlled. Who operates a freight business out of the South Quarter and paid Marshall Vance $43 in November of last year for continued operation without official interference. Page 3, second entry from the top. Dunn did not look at page 3. Where did this come from, he said carefully. Ruth looked at Wade. And Wade, for the first time since any of this started. Since the auction platform and the barn and the yard and the 2 cups of coffee going cold on the counter. Spoke in full sentences. In a voice that was the same low instrument it had always been, but with something different in it now. Like he'd been standing in a doorway a long time and had decided to come the rest of the way in. 3 years, he said. Vance ran a systematic operation across 4 counties in this territory. That notebook covers Harlan County. There are 2 additional sections. Dunn was very still. I was building a documented case, Wade said. Specific, verifiable. Sufficient for a federal inquiry. I had a timeline. A pause that had weight to it. Vance changed the timeline. How, Dunn said. He took a woman. Wade's voice didn't change in volume or inflection. Just delivered the fact the way you delivered a fact. Margaret Alderman, 28 years old, her husband runs the supply operation out of the South Quarter. Couldn't meet Vance's latest demand. Vance took Mrs. Alderman as what he called collateral. The word came out flat and precise, stripped of everything except what it was. He intended to hold her until the debt was paid. I went to negotiate. I had my own money, not department funds, my own, and I offered it, A pause. Vance wasn't interested in the money by that point. He was drunk and he was interested in something else, and he described what that something else was in specific terms because he thought it was funny. The room absorbed that. It wasn't funny, Wade said. Another silence. There was no time for a report, he said. No time for a wire to Denver and a response and proper authorization. There was time for one thing. I handled that one thing. You killed a federal marshal, Dunn said. I stopped a man who was going to harm a woman he was holding against her will, Wade said. He was wearing a federal badge while he planned to do it. The badge was not relevant to what I was stopping. The silence that followed had a different texture than the ones before it. Not assessment. Not the mechanical turning of official gears. This was Fletcher Dunn sitting in a stranger's front room in Harlan County, with 3 years of documented corruption in his hands, and the understanding settling into him that the case he'd ridden out here to close was not the case that had actually occurred. Why didn't you tell this to anyone when they arrested you? Dunn said. Not accusation. Something quieter. The beginning of an accounting. Because the notebook wasn't complete, Wade said. The Harlan County records were the only portion I had fully documented. If I'd identified myself and my assignment, anyone connected to Vance in the other counties would have had time to disappear before those sections could be verified. He met Dunn's eyes steadily, and because nobody asked why, they asked if I'd done it. I had. That was the question on the table. Dunn looked at him for a long moment. Nobody asked why. No, Wade said, they didn't. Ruth watched Dunn absorb this. The specific weight of a man recognizing a procedural failure that had a face now, and a farm it had been sleeping in, and a woman who had paid $2 out of her last money to make sure it didn't disappear into the county auction system and out the other side. I'm taking him into custody, Dunn said finally. Protective, not as a condemned man, while I verify what's in that notebook. Ruth felt the distinction land, heard the difference between those two positions, and filed it. She looked at Wade. He was looking at her with the attention that had stopped being unreadable at some point in the last 24 hours. Not strategic now. Not the careful assessment of a man rationing what he revealed. Just looking at her, the way a person looked at another person when they had run out of ways to be measured about something, and what remained was the thing itself. He looked at her, and the looking was deliberate. The way you looked at someone when you needed them to know the moment registered, that it was being kept, that some things mattered on their own terms before whatever came next had a chance to complicate them. She looked back, held it for as long as it lasted. 1 week, Dunn said to Wade. I send to Denver for verification. We proceed from there. Wade nodded once. Then he walked out with Dunn into the morning. And Ruth stood alone in the front room with the copy of the notebook she'd already made in the small hours while he slept, and the morning she had ahead of her, and the complete certain knowledge that she was not done with this. Not even close. She looked at the 2 cups of coffee on the counter, looked at the notebook in her hand, looked at the south fence that still needed mending, and the well that was running now, and the 80 acres of cracked Nebraska ground that she had not lost yet. There was work to do. She had read the notebook until past midnight. Wade had set it on the kitchen table without explanation, sometime during that first evening while she was washing up with her back turned, and when she came around and saw it sitting there, she understood without being told that this was not an accident. Not something dropped, something placed, deliberately, by a man who had run out of ways to give her what she needed to find without handing it to her directly. So she read it. Both cups of coffee went cold on the counter. The lamp burned low and she trimmed it twice and kept reading. Dates and names and dollar amounts in handwriting so small and careful it looked like the writer had known he might need to fit a great deal of truth into a limited amount of paper. 3 years of it. A catalog of what Marshal Denton Vance had been doing across 4 counties that had nothing to do with federal law enforcement, and everything to do with what a badge made possible when nobody was checking them. She closed it at midnight, set it flat on the table, and sat in the kitchen for a long time without moving. Then she made a copy. Longhand, her own handwriting. Working from the beginning. Every entry. Every date. Every name. She finished at 2 in the morning, put the original in the kitchen dresser drawer and the copy in her apron pocket, and went to bed. She was on the road to Harlan by 7:40, earlier than town business required, earlier than the courthouse records room opened. For that matter, But Elias Kern had a weakness for coffee brought to him before he'd made his own, which Ruth had learned at the inquest after James and had been storing as useful information ever since. She found him unlocking the side door with his key ring and the habitual expression of a man who had already left this place 3 times in his head before his body arrived. She held out the cup. Kern looked at it, looked at her, took it without a word, which was as close to enthusiasm as Kern got before 8 in the morning. 5 years of civil filings, Ruth said. Anything with Denton Vance's name on it. He let her in. 3 complaints. That was what 5 years of looking produced. First, a freight operator named George Alderman, whose filing described a pattern of official pressure applied at precise financial intervals. The language careful and particular in the way of a man who had thought hard about every word before committing it to paper. Second, a woman named Margaret Pratt who ran a boarding house on the north end of the county, whose complaint used the formal language of official documents to describe something that formal language was specifically designed not to say plainly. And the gap between what the language said and what it meant sat on the page like a bruise. Third, a rancher from the eastern quarter named Cooper Greer, whose situation matched entries in Wade's notebook on 6 specific points. The dates matched, the amounts matched, the name of the deputy Vance had sent to deliver the initial demand matched. All 3 withdrawn. All 3 within 6 weeks of filing. All 3 without stated reason. Ruth wrote down every detail in her own hand and cross-referenced against the copy of the notebook in her pocket. Built a picture on paper that wasn't complete yet but had a recognizable shape. Then she looked at the withdrawal dates again, 6 weeks each time, not random, not the slow erosion of someone losing nerve. 6 weeks was enough time to receive a visit from someone who knew where your grazing lease was filed and had opinions about what happened to it. She thanked Kern for his time and asked after his youngest daughter's situation with the cattle market, which was the kind of question that reminded people you were a person and not just an errand. He told her his daughter had done well, with a brevity that suggested he was pleased but wouldn't say so directly, which was also very Kern. She left and climbed the outside staircase to Elias Webb's office above the saddle shop on 2nd Street. Webb was 73. Had practiced law in Harlan County since before its current courthouse had its current paint. Lost cases against federal jurisdiction on 4 separate occasions. After each loss, he'd written a detailed letter to the territorial government in Denver about the specific nature of the failure and what ought to change. He knew the letters went into a drawer. He wrote them anyway, because a man who stopped writing letters he knew went into drawers had already agreed to something he shouldn't have agreed to. Ruth had met him twice before. Once at the inquest after James, once at the land registry when she'd refiled the farm paperwork under her own name. Both times he'd given her information without performing sympathy. She'd respected that enough to climb 40 years of opinionated staircase at 8:30 in the morning. She knocked. "Come in if you're not selling anything. Dry as creek bed in August." She came in. Set the notebook copy and her handwritten summary on his desk. Sat down without waiting to be invited because the morning had its own schedule and wasn't interested in formality. He read all of it. 15 minutes during which the saddle shop below produced its periodic sounds and a wagon went by on 2nd Street and the day moved forward without them. He didn't speak while he read. Ruth didn't experience the silence as something requiring her attention. Webb set the papers down, took his glasses off, cleaned them on the corner of his vest. "Detailed," he said. "Verifiable," she said. "The names are real. The amounts are specific. The dates can be cross-referenced against Vance's official travel records if anyone pulls them." She leaned forward slightly. "And there are 3 civil complaints in the county records that were withdrawn within 6 weeks of filing, each time under circumstances that aren't coincidental. I have the filings. The pattern is there for anyone willing to look at it as a pattern." He looked at her over the tops of his glasses in the way he'd looked at her at the inquest after James, figuring out what category of person he was dealing with. "What do you want me to do?" he said. "File a formal request for inquiry with the Territorial Justice Committee, based on the documented evidence. Filed by a member of the Harlan County Bar on the record, so it cannot be made to quietly disappear the way those 3 complaints disappeared. 4 times I've filed things that went into drawers in Denver. I know them. I have no particular reason to expect this time is different." "No," she agreed. "But the evidence this time has a specific shape that the others didn't. And you have a witness, which is me, who was present when the man who collected it explained exactly why he collected it and how Vance operated. I can testify to the pattern." She held his gaze steadily. "And Webberwin, 40 years in this office. You've earned the right to close on one." A silence in which Elias Webb appeared to make a decision. Not dramatically. Just quietly. The way a man of 73 made decisions. By letting them settle into the correct position. "Come back at 2, he said. She came back at 2. The draft was thorough and written in the precise language of a man who had lost 4 cases to federal jurisdiction and had therefore learned exactly which words the committee was legally required to respond to and which ones could be filed under discretion. She read it twice, suggested one change. He made it without argument, which told her the change was right and he'd already considered it. By 4 o'clock, the formal inquiry request was in the territorial mail, witnessed and sealed. She rode home in the late afternoon with the particular exhaustion of a day that had accomplished something real. Not satisfaction exactly, more the feeling after a long fence repair, when the wire is tight and the posts are deep and you haven't fixed everything but you've fixed this. And this is what today had available to fix. She put Buck up and went straight to the east corner of the barn, left wall. Under the floor, she moved the hay in 3 sweeps of her boot. Her foot found an edge. She crouched and worked the case free with her fingers, a leather case not much bigger than a slim book, worn smooth in the way of something carried close to the body for years. The smoothness wasn't from neglect. It was from the opposite of neglect. She carried it outside into the last of the afternoon light and opened it. The badge was brass, well maintained. The eagle and shield clear under careful polishing. An inscription on the reverse cut deep and clean into the metal. Us Deputy Marshal, appointed 1871. Special Attachment, Territorial Justice Division. Ruth sat down on the porch steps. She held the badge in both hands and let what it meant settle through her in layers, not rushing any of them. Not about the legal case. That calculation was already running and would reach its conclusion. This was about the man. About the specific shape of the life that had produced this object in this case under that hay. He had known someone would come looking. He had arranged to be sold at auction and had trusted that the arrangement would work. that eventually the right person would ask the right question, them. And he had waited in the specific way of someone who understood that patience wasn't passive, them. It was the only active thing available when everything else had been accounted for, and she had been the someone. Her hand going up before she'd decided to raise it, in a square full of people who had decided not to. She turned the badge over in her hands, them. Thought about the night she couldn't fully remember anymore. The girl she'd been at 12 on a creek bank in Kansas, them. The young man who had appeared from nowhere and gathered up 11 frightened people and walked them through the dark and left before morning without giving his name. 20 years was a long time. Long enough that the memory had simplified into feeling rather than detail. But the feeling had stayed precise. She rode to Dunn's boarding house at 7:15 the next morning. He answered the door in his shirt sleeves, them. She noted this and did not remark on it because the hour made formality beside the point. She held out the badge, he took it. Read the front, turned it over, read the reverse, read it again. His eyes moving over the letters with the deliberateness of a man who wanted to be certain he was reading what he was reading, them. Then he stood in the doorway with a federal deputy marshal's badge in his hand, and his face did something she didn't have a clean word for. Not surprise exactly. More the specific feeling of understanding something late that should have been understood earlier, and having the lateness stand right there in front of you, where you couldn't arrange it into something more comfortable. Where, he said. Barn stall, them. He hid it to protect his cover. If anyone had found this in the first week, the investigation into the other counties would have collapsed before it was documented. She kept her voice level. This was not the moment for accusation. She knew the difference between this moment and that one. He was protecting the ongoing work at the cost of his own situation. Dunn was still looking at the badge. If anyone had investigated them, they'd have found it in the first week, she said. Nobody asked why. Dunn said it back to her, quieter. Nobody asked why. Hearing him say it had a different weight than hearing Wade say it. Wade had said it as a plain fact, the way he said everything, them. Dunn said it as a man arriving at a truth by having been on the wrong side of it, and that was a different kind of understanding. Harder to come by and more reliable once it arrived. I'm sending to Denver this morning, Dunn said. The confirmation should come faster than the standard wire. I've flagged it urgent. He looked at her. You started the web filing before you found this, yes. Before you had confirmation, yes. A pause. What made you certain, them? Before any of this, when all you had was a notebook and a man from a county auction. She thought about how to answer that honestly rather than impressively. He carried 11 frightened people through the dark when he was young and asked nothing for it afterward, she said, them. And then 20 years later he spent 3 years documenting corruption that nobody asked him to document alone, writing it down in a notebook he had no guarantee anyone would ever read. And when the situation required him to act, he acted. And when it required him to be silent, he was silent. She met Dunn's eyes. A man doesn't do all of that for 20 years and then become a different man on the one night it would be convenient to believe he did, them. She turned to go. His voice stopped her. She turned back. He was still looking at the badge, not at her. I'll have a confirmation wire within 4 days, I expect. Denver moves faster when the request comes flagged with a special attachment notation. He paused. I should have looked for the why, them. It was available, I didn't look for it. She let that sit where he'd placed it. Some things didn't need a response. They just needed to be said out loud once by the person who needed to say them. She rode back to the farm. Worked the south fence that afternoon, the section that had been down since before James, which she'd been working around for 2 years. Them. Post by post and wire by wire. The clean satisfaction of a thing being made right by the application of steady effort and the correct tools applied in the correct order. She was on the 3rd section when she heard hooves and looked up. Agnes Dover was riding toward the property with the straight-backed purpose she used when she had somewhere to be, and the deciding was already behind her. She pulled up at the fence line. Had not come to visit them. The saddlebag on her right hip sat heavier than usual. Ruth set the wire stretcher down. I went to Dunn this morning, Agnes said. Her voice carried the flat precision she used when accuracy mattered more than comfort. Before I came here, Ruth waited. I told him about George. Agnes looked at the fence line rather than at Ruth, her way of having a conversation that had more in it than she was comfortable displaying directly. The amounts, the dates I remember clearly, which is most of them, because George kept records and read them to me every month so I would know. The dates I only approximate, which are 2. A pause. The name of the deputy Vance sent when George pushed back the one time. What the deputy said specifically about the grazing lease. The exact words she looked up. George wrote them down. He wrote down a great deal. She reached into the saddlebag and produced a stack of papers, folded and worn at the creases. George's ledger records. He marked the Vance payments separately. Dunn took copies. Them. She held the papers out. I brought you the originals because they should be somewhere other than one place. Ruth took them. George Dover's handwriting, neat, careful columns. And there in the margin of the first entry, them. In letters small enough that you had to stop and look for them. Not legitimate, Agnes. Them. Forgive. She looked up. I was going to say thank you, Ruth said. Don't. Agnes moved her horse a half step, the motion of someone who had more to say and was organizing it. There's something I didn't tell Dunn. Something I didn't put in my written statement. I'm telling you because you'll know what to do with it and Dunn might not yet. Ruth waited. The withdrawals, Agnes said. Alderman's complaint, and the Pratt woman's, and Cooper Greer's. Them. I know why they withdrew. She looked at the fence posts Ruth had been setting. Not because they lost nerve. Because someone visited each of them within a week of filing. Not Vance himself. Them. A man who worked for him. Them. Smaller operation. Them. Man named Fenwick. Them. Who never wore a badge but made it clear he knew where the badges were and what they could do. Them. He visited each of them and explained that the complaint had been noted and that Vance had a long memory and a particular interest in businesses that made use of county road access and water rights. She looked at Ruth directly. Fenwick is still in the county, runs a dry goods operation on the east end of 4th Street, has been here the whole time. Them. If the formal inquiry goes forward, someone is going to need to know where to look for the mechanism Vance used to keep people quiet, because it wasn't just Vance. Vance is gone, the mechanism isn't. Ruth held that information, turned it over. I'll make sure Webb knows before the committee convenes. Agnes nodded once, the nod of a woman who had done what she came to do and was returning to her own work. One more thing. I went to Dunn first this morning before I came here. I want you to know that it wasn't because you asked me. You didn't ask me, I know. I did it because George kept those records 4 years waiting for someone to ask them. He believed them. George did them. That if he documented it carefully enough and waited long enough, someone would eventually ask them. She gathered her reins. Yesterday I watched you ride into Harlan with that man. I watched the way you rode and I thought, there it is, there's the asking. She looked at the fence Ruth had been working on. Post depth looks right. Whoever set those went deep enough. She turned her horse. Thursday. I'll bring bread. She rode back toward her property with her usual straight-back deficiency, and Ruth watched her go, and thought about George Dover writing not legitimate in the margin of a ledger he knew his wife would eventually read, the faith that required, the patience. She went back to the fence, finished the 3rd section and started the 4th. The Denver wire came on the 4th day, which was faster than Dunn had estimated, and which Ruth took as confirmation that the special attachment notation on Wade's record had moved things in Denver the way Dunn had said it would. She was in the south field when Holt rode out with it, and the fact that Holt came himself rather than sending a deputy told her which direction he'd been moving in his own reckoning about this situation. She opened the envelope at the fence line with her work gloves still on. Callum Wade J. Identity confirmed. Deputy Marshal Special Attachment 1871. Territorial Justice Division. Assignment complete. Immediate release authorized. Conduct of investigation commendable. She read it twice, took her gloves off, looked at the farm. South fence standing where she'd set it. Barn with the patched east wall. Well stone in the center of the yard. The cottonwood. The 3 hens making their ongoing assessment of the afternoon. She thought about what it had taken to get here. Not her part in it, that was straightforward enough once she decided to do it. His part. 3 years of writing things down in a notebook with no guarantee the notebook would matter. Letting himself be sold for $2. Trusting that patience was the only currency that held its value when everything else had been stripped away. She put the wire in her apron pocket and went inside and made coffee. Set 2 cups on the counter. Stood in the kitchen in the late afternoon and waited, and the waiting felt different from the way waiting had felt for 2 years. Not the waiting of someone sitting next to an absence. The waiting of someone who knew what was coming and had simply to let it arrive. She heard them on the road before she saw them. 2 horses unhurried. When she went to the porch it was Dunn and beside him. No cuffs. No escort. No arrangement of official constraint around him at all. Wade Callum on a horse moving at whatever pace he set. He wore his own clothes. The badge was back on his vest. He carried a leather saddlebag she hadn't seen before, new or near enough, the kind of bag that held the equipment of someone who had made a decision about duration. He looked the same, he looked different. She needed a moment to locate the difference and then she found it. The thing that had been held at a particular tension for as long as she'd known him, the managed quality, the careful distribution of what he showed and when, had resolved into something else, not relaxed, something more permanent than relaxed. Like weight that had been carried wrong for a very long time had finally found the position it was meant to occupy. Dunn dismounted at the fence line and tied his horse to the post with the gesture of a man who would be here briefly and then leave. He walked to the fence. The department's formal commendation will follow by post, he said to Wade. Then to Ruth. The South Boundary Correction Webb mentioned the Vance land registration issue from 1874. I've flagged it with the Territorial Land Office. They'll prioritize it. The man fence. Agnes Dover's information. I've already sent a second wire. Ruth looked at him. He'd moved faster than she'd expected. Which meant he'd been thinking about it since Agnes told him, and hadn't waited for Ruth to bring it to Webb first. Thank you, she said. Dunn looked at them both with the expression of a man who had updated his understanding of a situation and arrived at a version he could respect. He untied his horse. You know where to find me. I know where I'll be, Wade said. Dunn mounted and rode back toward Harlan without ceremony. Wade watched him go, then turned back to the farm, and Ruth watched him look at it, the well and the barn and the fence line standing, all 80 acres he'd walked the perimeter of before the hearing, and she saw him add it up, He came through it, She latched it behind him, and they walked across the yard in the afternoon light, and Buck in the pasture raised his head, looked at them both with the measured regard of an animal deciding how much energy this development warranted, and went back to the grass. The highest form of approval Buck offered anyone. Inside, the 2 cups of coffee were still on the counter. She'd made them fresh when she heard the horses on the road, and they were the right temperature now, which felt like the kind of small precision the day had earned. She handed him one. He took it with the careful appreciation of someone who had learned not to assume simple things were permanent. They stood in the kitchen in the early evening light and drank coffee, and the house was quiet in the way of houses where something has just changed, and the change hasn't finished settling yet. Not uncomfortable. The opposite of uncomfortable. The quiet of 2 people who had come through a long thing together and were standing on the other side of it and didn't need to explain that to each other. 6 days before Denver, she said. The barn door latch, he said, and the north fence section, the corner of his mouth, and whatever else the place has been saving up. She looked at him across the kitchen, at the badge on his vest and the new saddlebag he'd set by the door, and the gray eyes that had stopped being an instrument he aimed, and had become something she read the way she read the land, not perfectly but reliably. The place has opinions about what it needs, she said. It'll let you know. It already has, he said. 4 things before I'd been here 2 days. That's a slow start for this farm. He made a sound, low and brief, that belonged entirely to him, and she thought, there it is. There's the man who's been standing just out of reach of that sound for 3 weeks. And now here it is, easy and unguarded, in her kitchen in the evening light. She picked up her cup. All right, she said. And that word, which had started as her word for things not yet organized, had somewhere in the last 10 days filled up with everything that was specifically all right. Not fixed, not uncomplicated, but correctly oriented toward what it was supposed to be, which was enough. More than enough. Enough was its own kind of abundance when you'd spent long enough without it. She went to start supper. He stayed at the counter and finished his coffee. And outside, the Nebraska evening was doing what it did when the heat finally broke, going soft and golden over the grass. And the farm received them both in the ordinary way of places that have been waiting for the right people to come back to them. 6 days before Denver, and the farm had its own agenda. The barn door latch needed replacing regardless of what was happening in territorial offices 800 miles away. The north fence section Wade had walked twice already was going to come down before winter if nobody addressed the post depth on the eastern end. The south drainage channel Wade had opened on the 3rd day needed checking after the rain that came through Tuesday night, light rain, the kind that barely counted in Nebraska but was enough to shift loosened soil. The farm was specific about its requirements and entirely indifferent to timing, which was one of the things Ruth had always respected about it. Wade worked the first 3 days with the same methodical attention he'd brought to the well. Not fast, not performed. Thorough in the way of someone who understood that thorough was the longer investment and the more durable result. The north fence posts went in 6 inches deeper than the original installation. which he'd identified as the source problem by studying the lean of the existing posts and calculating backward to the cause. The barn door latch went in on the second day, and with it the underlying issue, a settling in the door frame that had been making the latch fail for longer than the latch itself had been the obvious symptom, and he addressed both things rather than the one that showed. He found a soft spot in the barn floor she hadn't known about and repaired it before it became structural. He rebuilt the east corner of the chicken coop from materials already on hand and one trip to the hardware in Harlan that he made and returned from without explanation or accounting, and the new corner was square in a way the original hadn't been, and the three hens communicated something that might have been approval through their increased output. Buck followed him around the pasture. Ruth had a great many thoughts about that and was choosing which ones to have. On the fourth day after the specific urgent failures had been addressed, the character of Wade's work changed. He walked the full perimeter of the property at the deliberate pace of a man reading something rather than covering ground. Ruth watched him from different positions as the morning progressed. At the south pasture, crouching to examine the soil depth along the fence line. At the western rise, standing with his back to the farmhouse and his face toward the low hills, still for a long stretch. At the northern boundary where the property met the creek bed that ran low but ran. He wasn't assessing failures, he was learning the place. Memorizing it the way you memorized something you expected to be away from. She did not ask him about it. She understood what it was. On the fifth evening she made supper and called him in, and he came through the front door and washed his hands at the kitchen basin and sat down across from her at the table with the ease of a man who had been doing this long enough that the ease had become natural, which it had, which was its own kind of information. They ate. The evening light came through the window at the late summer angle that only existed at this time of year, at this time of day, putting a particular quality of gold across the floorboards that Ruth had noticed every year she'd lived in this house and had stopped remarking on because some things you just let happen to you. North post depth is going to hold through winter, Wade said after a while. The angle looked right when I set the last one. Ruth moved a piece of cornbread. Creek's lower than last August at this point in the season. Drainage on the east side of the south field was backing up, he said. Channel blockage about 40 yards in. I cleared it Tuesday. She looked at him. There's a drainage channel on the east side, there is now. The dry quality in his voice, brief and unhurried. Before that there was just the indication of one. The way the soil was compacting in a line. James probably intended to dig it out and didn't get there. She thought about that. About the farm her husband had carried in his head. The plans and intentions and the systems half built and the explanations half given. All of it waiting in the land for someone with the right knowledge to come along and find it. He had lists, she said. Long ones, kept them in a notebook by the bed. I couldn't read his handwriting well enough to follow most of them after he was gone. Wade was quiet for a moment. What happened to the notebook? Trunk in the bedroom. Couldn't throw it away and couldn't read it, so I put it where I didn't have to decide. He nodded. Didn't push past it, didn't make it larger than she'd offered it. Denver is tomorrow, she said. Yes. Outside, a nighthawk went over in the blue dusk, making its particular sound. The kind of sound that meant the season was turning even when the heat hadn't admitted it yet. Are you ready for it? She said. I've been ready for 3 years. He said it without performance. True in multiple directions at once, and they both understood the multiple directions, and neither of them named them. Because some things didn't need naming. Because naming them would have made them smaller than they were. She cleared the plates. He washed them without being asked, which he'd been doing since the third evening, and she'd stopped registering it as something to note and started registering it as how the evenings ended. The ordinary accumulation of a shared routine, which was its own kind of claiming even when neither party put a word to it. When the dishes were done, he stood at the kitchen basin drying his hands, and she was at the table, and the lamp between them was doing its small warm work, and the house had the quality it had in the evenings now, not empty, which was what it had been for 2 years, inhabited in the way that required 2 people to achieve. You walked the whole property today, she said. He set the drying cloth down. Yes, you were memorizing it. He looked at her across the lamplight, not caught, not defensive, just honest. She held his gaze. You don't have to memorize it. You could just know it because you're here. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I sent a letter to Denver 3 days ago. She waited. Before the hearing was scheduled, before the filing was submitted, before any of this had a known outcome. He looked at his hands, flat and still at his sides. The department offered me a new assignment. Different territory. 6 months. I declined it. She absorbed this. You didn't tell me. No, pause, because I've spent 5 years making decisions based on what the assignment needed, what the operation needed, what the evidence needed, what the people I was protecting needed. He looked at her steadily. I wanted to make one decision based on what I wanted without accounting for anyone watching to see if I'd get it right. I wanted to know that I chose this because I chose it. Was it the right choice, she said. He didn't perform certainty. He was not a man who performed things, he just said yes. She picked up the lamp to carry it to the counter, and the movement of the light changed the room's shadows. And outside, the Nebraska dark was doing what it did at this time of year. Going deeply and completely dark the way it only went when the moon wasn't yet up and every star was available. All right, she said. Which meant yes. Which meant I know. Which meant all the things that word had accumulated into, since she'd started using it as her word for the things that were specifically all right. The morning of the hearing came with the specific clarity of days that required something from you. No meteorological distinction from ordinary mornings. Just ordinary, the sun doing its reliable work. But something in the quality of attention the day demanded that made the edges of things sharper than usual. Ruth wore the dark blue wool dress she'd worn to church the last time she'd gone to church. The dress you wore when the occasion required you to be taken seriously by people who didn't know you well enough to take you seriously on your own evidence. It still fit. She'd always been built for work, and work didn't renegotiate your measurements. Wade wore his own clothes, clean, the vest with the badge. He'd shaved, which she noticed without remarking on, because remarking on it would have required her to account for the noticing, and she was saving her accounting for things the day actually required them. They rode into Harlan together on their horses, which was the practical arrangement, and also something else she filed under things to examine later when she had the bandwidth. The courthouse square was full in a way that had nothing to do with official notice. Harlan County was a community of people who didn't need a formal announcement to know when something official and significant was in motion. And the combination of a federal committee arriving from Denver and the formal web filing had moved through the county the way information always moved through small places, faster and more completely than anyone had explicitly transmitted it. She recognized most of the faces. The Henderson family, who had looked at her with weary sympathy since the auction, and were now looking at her with something she didn't have time to interpret. Sam Pryor from the hardware on 3rd. Elias Kern from the records room, which meant the records room was unstaffed today and Kern had decided this was worth it. Agnes Dover at the corner of the courthouse steps in her good dress with her saddlebag over one arm, wearing the expression of a woman who had made her decision and was here to execute it and would not be entertaining second thoughts. Webb met Ruth at the courthouse door. His best suit, which was very good. The suit of a man who'd bought it for a different kind of practice and had ended up in Harlan County with it, and had continued maintaining it because that was what you did with things of quality. Ready, he said. Yes, she said. Wade came through the door behind her. Webb looked at him the way he'd looked at Ruth at the inquest after James, assessing what category of person he was dealing with. You'll sit at the right table. You won't speak unless Aldridge addresses you directly. When he does, answer what he asks and nothing extra. Wade nodded once. Then Webb turned to Ruth. I'll call you, he said, when the moment's right. This surprised her, and the surprise must have shown because Webb said, I've been doing this 40 years. I know what closes a case. You have the sentence that closes this one. I'll call you when it's time. Inside the hearing room, every seat taken and people standing at the walls. 3 men from the Territorial Justice Committee at the long front table with the upright posture of men aware they were on someone else's ground. Aldridge in the center, compact, waxed mustache, the specific demeanor of a man who had conducted many proceedings and had developed opinions about how they ought to go. Dunn sat to the side in the position of participant rather than authority, and he'd pressed his suit, and he looked less certain than he'd looked in Ruth's kitchen, which she chose to read correctly, not as weakness but as the honest adjustment of a man who had updated his position based on new information and was living inside the update. Wade sat at the right table beside Webb, hands flat on the table surface, relaxed in the way of someone who had been in high-stakes rooms before and had found that trying to see everything was less effective than being ready for whatever came. Ruth sat in the first row. From here she could see the committee table, Wade's profile, Dunn's face, and the room without turning her head. Aldridge called the proceedings to order with the cadence of someone who'd done this many times and had a professional relationship with the sound of his own authority. The documents came first. Webb presented the notebook, formatted into a proper exhibit with a cover page and numbered entries, the work of a man who had lost 4 cases against federal jurisdiction and learned exactly which forms the committee was required to respond to. Dunn presented the Denver confirmation wire and read it into the record with the flat efficiency of a man fulfilling an obligation he'd identified as the correct one. Aldridge asked questions, good ones. She revised her assessment of him upward as the morning progressed. He wasn't looking for a way to close the proceeding quickly. He was looking for the actual shape of what had occurred, and that was the kind of inquiry you conducted when you were more interested in being right than in being finished. Agnes testified first among the gallery witnesses. She stood at the front of the room and told the committee about George, the amounts, the dates, the specific language Vance had used about the grazing lease when George had pushed back that one time. Her voice was level and precise, and she placed George's ledger records on the committee table with the confidence of someone depositing something that belonged to the record and had been kept from it too long. Then she returned to her seat and sat with the settled posture of a woman who had finished something that needed finishing. George Alderman testified next, the freight operator who had driven 2 days to be here, and who described Vance's operations with the specific detail of a man who had been keeping his own records without knowing they'd ever be useful. Then Margaret Alderman, composed and direct beside her husband, describing the 14 months of pressure and the night Vance had taken her, her voice steady in the specific way of someone who had decided that steadiness was the form her testimony would take and had not wavered from that decision. By the time the gallery witnesses finished, the room had changed in the way rooms changed when a sufficient quantity of specific truth had been deposited into them. Not quieter, if anything the murmuring had increased, but different in quality. The sound of a community recalibrating what it thought it had known about the last several years. Then Dunn stood. He stood for a moment before he spoke, which she hadn't seen him do before. He'd always had the words arranged in advance. This was something different. A man organizing not the words but his relationship to what the words were going to commit him to. I came to Harlan County to close a case I believed was factually straightforward, he said. A federal marshal was dead. A man was identified at the scene. The man offered no defense. He looked at the committee. I did not ask why. No one in the department asked why. We asked whether he had done the act, received confirmation that he had, and proceeded on that basis. A pause in which the room was very still. The why was available. It was in a barn stall. It was in 3 filed and withdrawn civil complaints in this county's records. It was in the account records of people who had been afraid to speak until someone gave them a reason to stop being afraid. He set his hands flat on the table. I am recommending full exoneration of Deputy Callum, and I am recommending a formal review of how the Vance operation went undetected for 3 years inside our own department. The failure was not contained to one county or one marshal. The gallery made a sound that wasn't applause. More the collective exhale of people who had been holding something and found a moment to set it down. Aldridge made notes. The committee conferred in the low professional register of men building a consensus they'd individually already arrived at. Then Webb stood and said without preamble, the committee may also wish to hear from Ruth McAllister. Before any of this was submitted or filed or confirmed, the person who asked why. Aldridge looked at her. She hadn't known Webb was going to do this. She would have thoughts about that later. She stood, walked to the front of the room, stood where Agnes had stood and looked at the committee and did not look at the gallery because the gallery was not the point. My name is Ruth McAllister. I own a farm 4 miles north of Harlan. 3 weeks ago, I spent my last $2 at a county debt auction to purchase the labor of a man no one else in the square would buy. She let that sit, because it was true and it had weight and the weight was relevant. On his 2nd day at my farm, he fixed a well that had been dry for 18 months. Not because the water was gone. Because a valve my late husband had installed and hadn't had time to explain was closed, and no one had looked for that specific solution. He found it because he paid attention to what was actually in front of him, rather than assuming the problem was what it appeared to be. The room was quiet in a way that had texture to it. In 1856, I was 12 years old, she said. My parents were killed in a bandit attack on a wagon train in Kansas. There were 11 of us who survived. We survived because a young man on horseback rode toward the shooting when everyone else was riding away. He gathered us up. He walked us through the night to safety. He left before we woke without giving his name. She looked at Aldridge directly. I did not know his name for 20 years. I learned it at a county auction when I paid $2 for him. Something moved through the room. Not a sound exactly, more like a change in pressure. The committee has documents and testimony and federal confirmation that establish clearly what Deputy Callum was doing and why he was doing it. I am not here to supplement the legal record. I am here to say that the legal record, however complete, does not account for the kind of man you're deciding about today. It tells you what he did. It doesn't tell you that he has been doing versions of it for 20 years without anyone asking. It doesn't tell you what it cost persons to go toward the problem every time, for 20 years without stopping, or what it cost to stay silent when speaking would have been easier, because speaking would have let the larger wrong continue. She paused. I think you should know that when you decide. She went back to her seat. The room was quiet for a held moment, and then it wasn't, not loud, but alive in the way of a space where people had heard something they recognized as true and were responding to the recognition the only way available to them, which was by breathing differently and shifting in their chairs and looking at each other with the faces of people who had just been told something they already knew but hadn't previously been able to say. Wade was looking at her from across the room. Not the strategic attention she'd first learned to read in him. Not the deliberate patience of someone outlasting a circumstance. Just looking at her the way a person looked at another person when they had used up all the ways of being measured about something, and what remained was the thing itself. She looked back, she held it. Aldridge called a brief recess, 15 minutes. Ruth stayed in her seat. Agnes appeared at her elbow and sat down in the chair beside her without invitation, which was so thoroughly Agnes that Ruth felt something loosen in her chest she hadn't registered as tight. You didn't warn me, Agnes said quietly. Webb didn't warn me either. Agnes looked at the committee table where Aldridge was conferring with his colleagues. You held up well, thank you. That's an observation, not a compliment, I know. Thank you anyway. They sat together in a silence that was comfortable, the way silences were comfortable between people who had been through something adjacent and had come out knowing where each other stood. Agnes said, after a while quietly, George would have wanted me to do this sooner. The flat certainty doing more work than usual. He kept those records because he thought someday someone would ask. Nobody ever asked. Someone asked, Ruth said. Yes. Agnes looked at her hands. Someone did. Aldridge came back. The committee settled. The room went attentive. 9 minutes. Ruth watched the clock on the wall because her hands needed something to do that wasn't gripping the chair arm, which she was also doing. Aldridge read without preamble, in the tone of a man who had decided and was not going to perform the having decided. All charges against Wade Callum arising from the death of Marshal Denton Vance in the Dakota Territory were formally dismissed. The actions of Deputy Callum were reclassified as lawful exercise of federal authority in the immediate protection of a civilian facing imminent harm. His record was noted as commendable for the conduct and duration of the Vance investigation. He was reinstated with full standing. The Territorial Justice Division in Denver was to receive a formal review inquiry regarding supervision protocols for undercover operations. The room made actual noise, not celebration exactly. Something more considered, the sound of a community arriving at a thing it recognized as correct and expressing that recognition, men shifting and exhaling. Someone behind Ruth saying something quietly that got a quiet response. Agnes beside her pressing her hands together once in her lap and then releasing them. Wade looked at Ruth from across the room. She looked back at him across the space and the 9 minutes and the 3 years and the 20 years, and all the accumulated distance between a creek bank in Kansas and a courthouse room in Nebraska. And what was on his face was not triumph and not relief. It was the expression of someone who had just watched a weight lifted from a place the weight had been so long that the lifted feeling and the ache of the lifting existed at the same time. She understood that completely. The gallery cleared in stages. Ruth stayed in her seat until the room was mostly empty. She needed a minute in the diminished space first, with the light coming in at its midday angle, and the chairs emptying around her, and the fact of what had just happened settling into something she could carry. Thomas Henderson came over before he left, stood in front of her and turned his hat in his hands. I should have bid, he said, at the auction. I was standing right there and I should have bid. I want you to know that. He put his hat on and left. Ruth sat with that for a moment. Webb came and stood beside her chair. He didn't sit. Looked at the front of the room where Aldridge was gathering papers. You knew you were going to call me, Ruth said. I knew, Webb said. You could have warned me. You would have practiced. He picked up his hat from the chair beside her. Practice testimony sounds practiced. Come see me next week. The south boundary of your property may have an issue related to a fraudulent land registration Vance pushed through in 1874. It'll want looking at. She filed that under the ongoing evidence that solving one problem generally revealed the outlines of the next. Dunn came over them. He stood with his hat in his hand and the expression of a man who had something to say, and was going to say it without the official register, which she could see required a small conscious effort. You were right, he said. What you told me at the boarding house. A man like that doesn't become a different man because it's convenient to believe he did. He met her eyes. I should have looked for the why. It was available and I didn't look for it. I'm sorry for that. You looked for it when it mattered, she said. You stood up in that room and testified when you didn't have to. That's not nothing. He nodded, put his hat on. I'll need Deputy Callum in Denver by end of next week for the formal reinstatement and the debrief on the Vance operation. A pause. He's the person with the most direct knowledge of how the undercover supervision protocol failed. Then he should give it to you, Ruth said. Dunn left. Wade came and sat down beside her in the vacated chair. He sat the way he sat everywhere, fully and without the provisional quality of someone expecting to be asked to move. 9 minutes, she said. He looked at the clock on the wall. You were counting, I needed something to do. A pause. Webb told me afterward that the most effective testimony is the kind the witness didn't have time to talk themselves out of. That is extremely correct, she said, and I'm still going to have a conversation with him about it. Something happened at the corner of Wade's mouth. Not the preliminary version she'd catalogued in those first days, the almost there that was gone before it finished arriving. The full version. Unguarded, brief and real and belonging to a man who had reasons for it. They walked out into the courthouse square together. The crowd had thinned but not dispersed, people finding reasons to stay in proximity to where the thing had happened. Agnes was at the square's corner, saddlebag empty and folded flat. Carl's name, she said when Ruth reached her, meaning George's. Webb entered the ledger records as exhibit. George's name is in the committee transcript now. Official. She looked at the square. It's a strange thing to have his name in an official record on the right side of something. Ruth looked at her neighbor, at the practical surface and what had been under it for 4 years, now lighter by some measure. Come Thursday, Ruth said. Bring the bread. I said I would, Agnes said. I'll be there. She left with her usual purposeful stride, and Ruth watched her go and thought that the fabric of a community was made of exactly these moments. The small decisions to show up and to speak, and to bring bread on Thursday, accumulating over years into something that held. They rode home in the late afternoon, side by side on the road north from Harlan, the sun dropping toward the western flats, the light going gold over the dry grass. Neither spoke for the first mile. The silence between them was the kind that didn't need filling. The deep silence of two people who had been through a long thing together and had arrived somewhere and were letting the arrival be what it was. People looked at you differently in there, Wade said after that mile. Not just the news, the way they looked at you before the ruling. Henderson crossing the room. That's not a response to new information. That's people seeing something they already knew and not having found the right angle on it until today. That's going to complicate things, she said. Probably. He glanced at her. I think you've been doing it without realizing. The noticing part. It's the being noticed part you've been avoiding. That's very specific of you. I'm a detail man. The dry quality, perfectly calibrated. It's the training. She laughed. Real laughter. The kind that came up without preparation. And it surprised her a little. The ease of it. The ease itself was its own information. The farm came over the rise as it always did, presenting itself without ceremony. The way things presented themselves when they'd been there a long time and had stopped needing to make an impression. Ruth saw it with the eye she'd been developing for 2 years, the eye that counted what remained. Well running. South fence standing. Barn with the level door and the replaced latch. The cottonwood doing its patient annual accounting. That evening he set a small velvet box on the kitchen table, not between the coffee cups. Beside them, where it didn't require either of them to look past it to look at each other. Dark blue velvet worn at the corners in the way of something carried a long time. She looked at the box. Looked at him. I should tell you when I bought these, he said, because the when matters. She waited 1871, the year I was appointed. First month. I was in Denver receiving the assignment and the badge and the terms of the work. I was in a store buying bootlaces and I saw these and I thought. He stopped. Found the right sentence. I thought that I'd been moving for 15 years and I didn't know what I was moving toward. And I thought that when I found out, I should be ready. He looked at her. I've moved them from one set of saddlebags to another for 5 years. Ruth opened the box. 2 rings, gold plain. The kind that said one thing clearly and meant it without embellishment. The kind that didn't need anything added because what it was saying was already complete. "You haven't asked me anything yet," she said. "I'm aware of that." The corner of his mouth. "I'm working up to it. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her across the lamp and the TIFF table, and everything between the auction square and this kitchen, the well and the hearing room and the 9 days, and all the mornings and evenings accumulated into a life they'd been building without naming it while they built it. "Ruth McAllister," he said. "I rode toward the shooting at Bright Creek when I was young because I couldn't make myself do otherwise. I ended up in your barn because the situation required it. I stayed in your yard because I wanted to." A pause that had the weight of a man being precise about something that mattered. "I want to stay in your yard for the rest of the available time. That's what I'm asking." "That's a good asking," she said. "Is it enough of one?" "It's exactly enough," she said. She took the smaller ring out of the box and placed it on her finger. He placed his on his own. They looked at each other over the lamp in the kitchen of the McAllister farm. And outside the dark was doing what it did when the sky was completely clear. Opening all the way up. Every star available. More than you could count and more than you needed. The wedding happened 3 weeks later on a Thursday, because Thursday had become the day things happened between this farm and the people connected to it, and there was no reason to abandon that pattern for something as significant as a wedding. Agnes came with bread and the settled presence of a woman who had decided her position relative to Ruth McAllister and was not revisiting it. Webb read the ceremony in his best suit because he was licensed to do so in the territory and had suggested it himself with the quiet satisfaction of a man intending to close the year on a win. Holt came and stood at the edge of the porch with his hat in his hand and the expression of a man who had gotten to the right side of something eventually and was giving himself partial credit for the eventually. Dunn rode in from Harlan unexpected, tied his horse at the fence post, walked up to the porch with a pie from the bakery on 2nd Street, held in front of him in the manner of someone who had decided to come and had made the correct practical decision about what to bring them. He set the pie on the kitchen table and came back out and stood in the yard for the ceremony with his hat at his side, which was the most informal Ruth had ever seen him, and it suited him considerably better. Webb read the words in the evening light, the words that had been said in every territory and state and piece of open ground in this country for a long time, because some arrangements required formal acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement was part of what made them real. When Webb reached the relevant closing instruction, Wade looked at Ruth the way he'd looked at her at the fence gate coming back from the hearing. The look of a man arriving somewhere he'd been trying to reach and had reached. He kissed her once, brief and certain and warm, and from the front row Agnes said in her carrying voice, "Well, finally." Laughter from all of them, even Dunn, even Holt. The specific laughter of people who had been through something together and come out the other side with enough left to find it funny. November came. Nebraska November without apology. Ruth knew on a Tuesday morning, knew the way her body reported certain things before her mind had been consulted, the specific quality of knowing that preceded confirmation certain before it was verified. She let the day have its ordinary shape and waited until supper, when the plates were cleared and the coffee poured, because some things belonged at the table where they were both in the habit of being honest. Wade was across from her, both hands around his cup. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the North Barn addition." He looked up, the full attention she'd learned to read as him fully present to something rather than managing it. "The design," she said. "I think it needs adjustment." He set his cup down. "Why, because by June," she said, "you're going to need space for something that isn't hay or tools or a horse." The kitchen was very quiet. She held his eyes. Not performing steadiness. Just steady, which was what she was. He stood up from the table, not leaving, coming around it, sitting in the chair beside her, which was not where he sat, which was a choice. He put his hand over hers on the table, flat and careful and warm, the hand that had fixed the well and carried 11 people through the dark and placed a ring on her finger. "June," he said. Around then. He looked at their hands, at the kitchen around them, the window with November pressing at the glass, the lamp, the 2 cups that had been 2 cups every morning and every evening since he'd come back through the gate. "I'll start on the addition next week," he said. "I want to look at the foundation first." "There is no foundation," she said. "There will be. The dry quality surfacing, brief and real. That's how you start them." She looked at him, the jaw and the gray eyes, and the particular something that appeared when it suited, and thought about creek banks and valves and notebooks and all the solutions that had been waiting in the dark for someone to arrive with the right question. "You're going to be all right," she said. The sentence came up without planning, the way true things sometimes did. He went very still. Not the managed stillness, not the patient kind. The stillness of someone who has just received the exact right thing at the exact right moment and is holding it without intermediary. Yes, he said. I think I am. Outside, the November wind moved over the 80 acres of the Callum farm, which was also the McAllister farm. Both names belonging to it now the way both people belonged to it. And made its low sound against the barn boards and the rope on the windlass and the south fence standing straight in the dark. In June, when the wheat came in for the second consecutive season, and the light went long and gold over Nebraska the way it only went in June, Ruth Callum stood on the porch in the early morning and held a boy who had arrived with his father's dark hair and his mother's comprehensive opinions about the available information. Wade stood beside her with one arm around her shoulders and looked at the farm the way he'd looked at it the morning he walked the perimeter before Denver, adding all of it up. The well running, the fence lines holding, the barn with the level door, the cottonwood doing its patient annual accounting. James, Ruth said. She'd offered the name 2 nights before, quietly and as a question, because that was how she offered things. He'd said yes before she finished asking. James Wade Callum had arrived in the world on a June morning, looking at everything available with the focused inventory of someone taking thorough stock of a place they intended to stay. Wade put his finger out. The boy's hand closed around it. Not metaphor, the fact of it. The small hand finding the large one in the morning light, practicing the first skill that mattered, which was the skill of holding on. Ruth looked at Wade's hand and her son's hand and the yard and the wheat going gold and the well stone in the center of it with water in it, which had always had water in it, which you knew once you knew where to look, once you had someone beside you who was going to stay long enough to look with you. The sun came up over Nebraska without ceremony, the way it always had, the way it would go on doing. The wheat was taller than at this hour yesterday, the well was running, and on the porch of the Callum farm, in the long light of a June morning, a family stood in the ordinary extraordinary fact of having found each other, which was what happened when you went toward the problem instead of away from it, and kept going for as long as it took.